Well, good day, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Lenny Marcus. I'm the co-director of the National Preparedness Leadership Initiative, a joint program of the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and the Harvard Kennedy School of Government Center for Public Leadership. Shortly after 9/11, the federal government came to Harvard, met with David Gergen, who was chair of the Center for Public Leadership at the Kennedy School, and me, and asked if Harvard University would establish a platform that would specifically look at crisis leadership. It would look at how to teach crisis leadership, conduct research on crisis leadership, and develop a curriculum that would be useful for leaders throughout the country in dealing with large, complex events. From that, we developed the concept called meta leadership, which is what we're going to be looking at today. The prefix meta means you're looking at a very, very broad range of factors and trying to understand a complex problem. Certainly, COVID-19 requires us to have that very, very broad view in understanding not only the health consequences, the economic and the social and the organizational and professional consequences as well. So to understand COVID-19, it requires that very wide meta perspective. Similarly, to develop solutions for addressing the issues of and the problems of COVID-19, it likewise takes a very, very broad view to develop those solutions. The theme today is about you, and the premise being that you're in a leadership position, and with that, it's you're it. And what does that mean? How do you leverage this notion of you're it in your leadership and apply the tools and ideas of meta leadership? So you're it. Well, what does that mean? And many times you're in the middle of a crisis situation. It could be a crisis in your office, a crisis in your organization, or in your system. And people look toward you. That is your you're it moment. And just to provide you some grounding in what that means, just remember back at a time when you feel that you've had a you're it moment, when people were looking toward you. Or it might be another instance in which someone else that you're working with, perhaps your boss, a colleague, someone in another organization, had a you're it moment. Now, there are two meanings to the word you in the English language. First, it's singular. It's about you, the leader, and your sense of responsibility. The fact that people, in fact, are really looking to you and hoping and expecting that you will provide the required leadership in the midst of whatever crisis your organization is facing. The other meaning of the word you is plural. So you as the crisis leader, you as the meta leader, look at the other people who are part of your team, the other people who are part of your system, and say you, plural, are it. Our theme in this conference is public-private partnerships. And what that means is you've got a group of people, presumably up-and-coming partners, who look at one another and say, you're it, we're it. And if we're going to be able to resolve whatever is facing us in this crisis and the many complexities of COVID-19, this is a matter of taking that responsibility. How do you use that as a cue? In that moment, when you recognize that this is my you're it moment, that's when it's important for you to recognize the importance of you being disciplined as a leader, you being really focused on what needs to be done. So our definition of leadership is people follow you. Yes, someone's title is critically important. However, when we step back and study leaders, the question is not simply what someone's title is, but rather, are people actually following you? If you've identified the nature of the crisis, if you've figured out what needs to be done, if you've got all that and other people aren't following you, then you're not really the leader. So the question through the lens then of meta leadership is what it's going to take for you to develop that discipline, that understanding, the motivations of the other people who are part of this potential public-private partnership, and then people will actually follow you. So that, for us, is the measure of your leadership. The next is that leadership really matters. And we're in the middle of a fascinating social experiment in this country, looking at different states and the different leadership approaches that were taken by different governors and different mayors, but what they were going to do in their jurisdiction. And it's very easy then to correlate the cases, the case counts, the hospitalizations, what's going on in each state, and correlate that to leadership strategies, actions, and behaviors of the governor or those people who are in charge. Similarly, you can look at that even in the context of your organization. The extent to which the leaders understood this COVID-19 challenge and what strategies and tactics and logistics they put in place to meet it head on. Leadership really does matter. And at the end of the day, it's so what? So what were you able to accomplish as a leader? How were you able to leverage the capacities, the information, the leverage of other organizations in order to achieve your leadership objectives in that moment when you're it? So what we're going to do today is talk about meta leadership, which is this broad overarching way for you to understand the nature of the crisis that faces you, and for you to understand strategies, tactics, next steps in order to meet the crisis head on. What you're going to learn is, in part, getting smarter than your brain, understanding what happens to your brain when you're in the midst of a crisis. How do you then understand the complexity of the scenarios that you're facing as a meta leader? And then I'll share with you some very, very specific tools that can help you to master the complexity. That YOURE prompt in and of itself is important as a tool for your leadership. And so the next time you find yourself in the middle of a crisis, in the middle of a challenge or a situation, just stop. This is my YOURE moment, and go through the pivot to intentionally decide what you're going to do next, the information you're going to gather, and then how you're going to be able to succeed in getting people to follow you. So let's look at what meta leadership is all about. As we developed the meta leadership model over these last 17 years since the NPLI was established, we begin with the notion of complexity. Complexity means that in any different situation, there are a number of factors that are happening simultaneously. And while it would be nice to say, here's the problem, here's the solution, done, in a nice linear fashion, when we're dealing with a large complex crisis such as COVID-19, it's very complex. There are a lot of different factors that come into play. There's the behavior of the virus itself. There are financial issues that come into play. There are capacity issues for testing or hospitalization or ventilators. And all of these different issues interplay with one another. So it's not simply, well, here's a problem, I'll solve it, done. It's that problem is related to other problems, related to other people. And so when we're looking at this question of how to practice meta leadership, we begin with the notion, as difficult as it may be, that you're leading through scenarios of complexity. Therefore, the dimension of meta leadership that captures that is what we call the situation. You, as a meta leader, are in the midst of a situation. You didn't necessarily create the situation. However, it's incumbent upon you to understand what's going on, to have some way of organizing your understanding of what's happening, and then working with others to figure out what needs to happen to resolve that situation. Many leadership models have the leader on top and a very, very nice pyramid with everyone in a command and control situation reporting up to this leader. The leader makes commands and everything goes down. Our model of leadership is different. In meta leadership, we view the person of the meta leader in the midst of that situation. And so your capacity as a meta leader to understand what's going on in this situation requires you to bring emotional intelligence, understanding, your self-awareness, and your ability for self-regulation. It's your ability to be in a situation that could be a panicking situation and to get yourself out of that panic mode. Being able to instill confidence in yourself, that instills confidence in other people. So that people follow you is in part because of the confidence that you're displaying that other people will follow. Now, what about those other people? Your responsibility as a meta leader is to build connectivity of effort, to get everybody on the same page, working together, the partnership that we're talking about in the conference here today, and being able to leverage each other's knowledge and capacities. And with that, you're leading in multiple directions. In part, you're leading down. Now, that's the pyramid. That's the bulk of the literature on much of the leadership field. We think that's important, though in meta leadership as a discipline, it's only one side of where you're leading. And that's the people who call you boss. You're also leading up to your boss. You might be a subject matter expert, or you might have a particular area of expertise or responsibility. So your job is briefing up to your boss, influencing your boss, and that's where influence beyond authority is critical to meta leadership. In other words, if your boss is following you by virtue of your recommendations or advice, that's part of what we call the people follow you. It's not only subordinates, it's people throughout your system, given your understanding and your recognition of what actions need to be taken in the midst of this crisis. Now, you're also leading across to other people, to other offices or departments or professional groups within your organization, and you're leading beyond to people and to organizations and constituencies beyond your organization. So when we're talking about meta leadership, it's being able to lead in all of those directions and to get situational awareness in all of those directions. Now, over these 17 years since we first developed meta leadership, and we've been building upon it over these years, the way we study leaders is we embed with them in the midst of a crisis. So way back when, I was with Mike Brown down during Katrina, was there when he was relieved of duties by Secretary Chertoff, and when Coast Guard Admiral Thad Allen took over, was with Admiral Allen during the Deepwater Horizon down in the Gulf and in Washington, with Dr. Rich Besser during the H1N1 pandemic, and recently with leaders of the current crisis as they've been struggling through all the decisions and actions that have been taking place. One of the things that we recognize in watching our students and colleagues lead through these very, very difficult events is their success comes when they're able to encourage everyone to turn to one another and say, how can I help make you a success? Because if everyone, all the different constituents, the people in the partnerships that you're looking at today, if everyone can turn to one another with this notion of how can I help make you a success, that's critical to your being able to accomplish whatever mission you have as a crisis leader. So that is in many ways what we consider the key to being able to practice successfully as a meta leader. Let me give you an example of this. So here is a YOURE moment for one of our colleagues, Admiral Peter Neffinger. Peter was in our executive education program at the NPLI when he was a captain in the Coast Guard, went on to the Admiral in the Coast Guard in that Great Lakes region of the Coast Guard, and then was asked by Admiral Allen to be the Deputy National Incident Commander during Deepwater Horizon, eventually was promoted to Vice Commandant of the Coast Guard, and later in 2015 was confirmed as the TSA administrator and served until the inauguration of President Trump. Peter, we're proud to say, is now on the faculty with us as a distinguished senior fellow with the NPLI at Harvard. So you might remember it was spring 2016 that there were wait lines around the country. Peter was confirmed in July 2015. Before his confirmation in June 2015, a report was leaked from the Inspector General of the Department of Homeland Security that reported over 90% of dangerous items that were taken through TSA lines were not detected by TSA officers. So the next month, when Peter was confirmed, all of a sudden it was his problem. As he said in June, that was somebody else's problem. But the day after I was confirmed, now that's my problem. And one of the things that Peter did, because he felt it was really important for TSA to capture and stop all of those dangerous items that were being potentially moved through security, is they ended the expedited screening program. And with that, because there was no expansion in the workforce, all of a sudden, as you can see in this picture here, lines started growing at airports. And by the time it got to early 2016, and you might remember back then, you get to the airport and you think, oh, I made it just in time. I'm going to race through security and get to my flight just on time. And all of a sudden you see this big wall of security lines. People were really unhappy in that period of time. Well, in March, Peter was on his way to a meeting with other aviation security leaders when his plane arrived in Brussels. Fortunately, it was 20 minutes late. And just as the plane was coming up to the jetway, the pilot screeched on the brakes. This was the scene, March 22nd, 2016. There was a bomb, two bombs, that were detonated in the pre-screening area of the Brussels airport. So the very place where those long security lines were taking place around the United States was targeted in Brussels. And with that, Peter's job significantly changed. Those long lines weren't simply an inconvenience. It wasn't simply a matter of people not making their planes. It became a significant aviation security problem that now was facing airports around the world. Well, that had a lot of people unhappy. And here's a picture, May 20th, 2016. And this is Peter speaking at a press conference, members of Congress. It's Rahm Emanuel, who's right behind him. And after this meeting, Peter and I spoke, and he said, gee, I didn't know you could get the F word into a sentence so many times. So Rahm Emanuel, the mayor of Chicago, was really unhappy about those wait lines in Chicago, up to 4 hours. So this was a significant meta leadership problem for Peter. In part, it was about leading down. And Peter realized that when he got into TSA, he had to gain the confidence of the transportation security officers. He developed the administrator's intent to try and rally them to their mission. His job was also leading up to members of Congress. You see Jay Johnson, who was the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security at the time, as well as up to the White House to get them behind the solutions that he was building. He had to lead across to other components of Department of Homeland Security to get them on board with the solutions as he was building them. And then he had to lead beyond. He had to involve the airlines if he was going to build a solution to this overarching problem facing aviation security in the United States. It required him to reframe how they were looking at the problem. And up to this point in Chicago, the overall consensus was the problem is TSA. Everybody was against TSA. And at this point, what Peter did is he brought in all this thinking of meta leadership and rallied everyone along the lines of how can I help make you a success? We were working with the senior leadership of the TSA at the time. We're teaching them these methodologies, and they were able to apply them to develop a set of solutions. The first and most important was, believe it or not, the TSA had no idea how many passengers were coming to the airport on any given day. So they were able to convince the airlines, who wanted a solution as well, to share what would be the passenger flow every day. Well, because they hadn't had the passenger flow, they weren't able to readjust how many TSOs were at the airport in accordance with the people coming in. So every morning, starting in May, right after this meeting in Chicago, the airlines shared that information. How many people were coming to the airport today? How many people are coming tomorrow? And then with that, TSA was able to adjust their work base so that they could meet that demand. They also got the support of Congress in being able to have flexibility in how they were able to take people from part-time to full-time. And with that, the cooperation of the airlines, the airports came in. How can we help you to facilitate this process. It had been forecast that Memorial Day 2016 would be an absolute mess with a high volume of passengers. But once, with this notion of how can I help make you a success, once all of these different stakeholders were oriented together to solve the problem, to really collaborate and cooperate with one another, the public-private partnership that you're looking at in this conference, they were able to build a very, very rapid solution to that aviation security problem. So the question for you is, looking at the complex problems that you're facing, how might you be able to bring together the different stakeholders to align them toward how can we help make you a success? Now, in that middle picture there, it wasn't one of Peter's happiest days. And what we call that is Peter was in the basement. Well, what does that mean, in the basement? This is one of the central ideas of meta leadership. Well, in the middle of your brain is a structure called the amygdala. And the amygdala is constantly checking what's going on. And as long as there's no danger, there's no risk, your amygdala is dormant. However, if all of a sudden there was something happen, it could be what Peter was facing in Chicago with Rahm Emanuel, could be COVID-19, it could be a financial shortfall, whatever it is, your amygdala ignites, and we call that in meta leadership terms, you've gone to the basement. And when you go to the basement, your brain is completely locked and you get into that triple F response. You either freeze, flight, or fight. And believe it or not, those circuits in our brain are the same circuits that we can find in more primitive species. For example, a rabbit is out in the wild, a prey comes along, the first thing the rabbit does is freeze, trying to camouflage itself in its environment. Next thing, if the prey gets closer, flight, runs away. And if the prey gets very, very close, it fights to try and protect itself. Those same circuits are in our brain. As a meta leader, then, it's important for you to recognize that I'm in the basement. And it's important, therefore, to recognize how you're going to get yourself out of the basement and then how you can get other people out of the basement as well. It requires a pivot. And we call that going to your tool chest. So first, admit I am in the basement. Next, in getting into that toolbox, it's asking yourself, hold it, what's the to-do list here? What's the critical things that need to be done? You ought to prepare what that to-do list is even before you get to that scenario. That's where exercises and planning, and also the discipline of your mind. So you're in the basement, what's my to-do list? Get to that to-do list. Your brain, once it recognizes that you're doing something to respond to the threat, will calm down. If you're still in the basement, the higher level of thinking of your brain is shut off. The primary function of your brain to ensure your survival. To do that, it cuts off that higher level thinking. So by getting into your to-do list, getting into that toolbox, what you're doing is, we call this getting smarter than your brain. You're activating your brain. And when other people see you in that to-do list, they get into that to-do list as well. And what that does is getting people focused and oriented, resolving some of the first-rate problems. And with that, your brain gets to the point where you're able even to go to that higher level of this is where our cognitive functions, our higher level thinking, to understand what's going on in the situation, what's the gap between that situation and what we're doing, and then how do we close that gap strategically in order to address the problem at hand. We call that working with your brain, or getting smarter than your brain. And if you remember that picture with Peter Nevinger, when he was in Chicago with Rahm Emanuel, he was in the basement. So part of his responsibility, getting himself out of the basement, activating the system, how can I help make you a success in order to develop solutions in the midst of a crisis? So that's the person of the meta leader, a taste for you of the person of the meta leader. Now, the situation, what tool could you use to help you understand the situation that we're going through COVID-19? As we've been studying crises over these years, and one that comes to mind were the hurricanes of 2017. Remember, there was Harvey, and then there was Irma, and then there was Jose, and then there was Maria, that there were a series of events that took place that challenged the emergency management system. And at that time, we developed this notion of the arcs of a crisis. So what is the arc of a crisis? First, an arc in part is about time and the effort that will be needed in order to respond to this crisis. And then the second thing about an arc is how high the threat or the challenge is. So think of it like the St. Louis arc. A crisis starts up and you can see that it's beginning to mount, and then it gets higher and higher, more and more cases. You reach that high point, and then on the other side, the situation begins to resolve. You can see that in a hurricane response, in a tornado response. And likewise, we've been asking ourselves the question, how does this notion of the arcs of time help us in forecasting what's going to come next, anticipating what's going to come next, getting us prepared for what we're likely to experience over that arc of time, and then charting our progress through it. So what are the dimensions of the arc? Well, first off, it's the width. How long is this arc going to take? How much time will this period of the crisis? Next, how high will it be? And the height could be measured in the number of cases, the amount of destruction, the nature of the threat. So there are dimensions to this arc, and as a meta leader, what you do can affect the dimensions of that arc. If you're very lax, the cases could go very high. If you're very, very disciplined and you've got a high compliance in your population, the number of cases could be much lower. So at the apex, that's where that leveling off happens. The arc begins, the numbers of cases and the threats begin to recede. And as it recedes, you then begin to transition from one arc to the next. And the question is how many arcs there will be over the course of a crisis. Now, just to give you an example of the structure of an arc, and let's go back to mid-March when we began the shutdowns and the sheltering in place in this country. What happened? Well, as you open up, as you begin that stretch up the arc, you're primarily transactionally focused. There's specific actions that need to take place. You're collecting data. And when you're there, so if you can imagine back in January of 2020, we could foretell, based on what was going on in China, that we were at the beginning of an arc of time with COVID-19. And the people that we were meeting to, the crisis leaders we were meeting to, were anticipating what could be happening here in the United States and what will need to be done about it. So in the beginning, primarily transactions. You try at the point where you're getting up to that apex, that's the beginning of the transition. That's the leveling off. You're looking at data to establish at this point, we think we've maximized on the number of cases. We've got controls in place. We know what's necessary in order to support the reduction of this threat. And then as you're going down that arc, you begin to look at the transition. What comes next in this crisis, and how do we plan for the next phase of this crisis so that as we transition to the next phase, things hopefully are going to improve. So in the best case scenario, and I want to say of these next two slides, the NPLI faculty instantly mobilized in March, and then in early April, we developed the best case scenario for COVID-19 using this arcs of time model, and the worst case scenario. So there's some inaccuracy here, but it's just interesting looking at how the best case scenario is playing out in some states and how the worst case scenario is playing out in other states. We were a little bit off on the timing. However, it's interesting just to see how this scenario is playing out. So the first arc of time, that's, remember, when we were all at home, the cases and the deaths were peaking. Remember, it was going on in New York City. In the second arc of time, we're monitoring the cases, and hopefully the numbers of cases are going down. We're certainly seeing that here in Massachusetts. Certainly people's tolerance for sheltering in place is waning. They really want to get out in this second arc of time. And as we look at the third arc of time, there are businesses, schools are beginning to look at this question of reopening, testing is far more available now that we're in the summer period. Here in Massachusetts, our number of cases, deaths, and hospitalizations significantly down. And so we see that this arc of time will continue into the fall, hopefully. If we get flu vaccines going, if there's another flu, we can keep the cases going down. That arc could last a little bit longer. And then finally, we'll get into that vaccination period, and it will take us ultimately to what we call the next normal in a post-COVID world. So this is the best case scenario of very, very carefully managing the COVID-19 cases, putting testing, putting appropriate policies in place to try and actively reduce the threat, and with that, a series of arcs of time through which we will be going. At that time, we were looking at how leaders could be leading the orderly progression from one arc of time to the next. We also considered what would be a worst case scenario, looking forward back in that early May period. And again, starts with this first arc. There was a rise of cases, and hopefully with the shelter in place, the numbers of cases would go down and begin the transition into the next arc of time. We were concerned that there would be, in some states, people would not continue sheltering in place. The suspensions would be lifted way too early. We were concerned about a lot of pent-up energy and people. We did not know, obviously, about the George Floyd killing and the impact that that would have in terms of social unrest and raising issues of social justice, and the impact of that within the context of COVID-19, raising important conversations, however, certainly complicating the nature of the crisis across the country. And with that, our concern that that could lead to civil disobedience, uncontrolled cases, hospitals getting to the point where they could barely cope with the increased number of cases, leading to a next arc of time where supply chains are broken, cases are widespread, potentially millions of people dead around the world, even rising numbers within our own country, to the point where it could even threaten civil institutions. So this would be a worst case scenario. And from our perch, what leaders are doing, the decisions that are made, the actions that are taken are leading us in some states towards that arc of time that is a best case scenario, and leading us in other states and in other countries around the world, we're seeing this worst case scenario. From our perspective, this is a question of leadership. The decisions that are being made, the ways those are being executed, and the compliance, for example, in the population with wearing masks, with physical distancing, washing hands, and everything that's needed to stem this virus. From our perch, this is a fight. It's a fight between that COVID-19 virus and an intelligent human species. And the question is, who's going to win? And in this particular scenario, we think leadership is critical to that question. The last tool that I want to leave you with, and I've purposely left time for questions at the end of this conversation. Put your questions into the chat room. Sarah is doing a great job of monitoring those questions. She'll be relaying those questions to me, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. We're, by the way, covering a lot of material in 1 hour, not a full semester at Harvard. We're covering a lot of material, so I'm happy to answer your questions. One of the crises that we studied was the response to the Boston Marathon bombings. You know, usually if there's a crisis that we're studying, it requires us to go down to the Gulf during the Gulf oil spill, or go to Atlanta during H1N1, or go to Washington during the TSA aviation security crisis. In the case of Boston, this was literally in our own backyards, very close to our offices in Harvard Square, in Cambridge. And so it also involved many students of our NPLI executive education program and people that we knew beforehand. So with that, we studied the leaders of the Boston Marathon bombings. And one of the things that was unusual about this group of leaders is usually when we're dealing with looking at a large complex event, such as this, there's one person who was identified in charge of the overall operation. Again, Admiral Thad Allen during Deepwater, Dr. Rich Besser during H1N1, Peter Neffenser during TSA. And when we were studying the Boston Marathon bombings and we were interviewing all of the leaders that you see in this picture, Governor Deval Patrick, Ed Davis, right behind him, the Boston Police Commissioner, Rick DeLoria, right on the right side of the picture, a special agent in charge of the FBI in the hat, Tim Albin, who was colonel in charge of the Massachusetts State Police. And we asked them, well, who was in charge? And what was fascinating is they said, well, we were working together in such a collaborative way that we each were in charge of our own organizations. However, as a group of leaders, if there was a particular question, that person took the lead. However, we were truly working together in trying to understand the situation, in building solutions, and in collaborating at that level. And what was fascinating is, as we started studying, going through all of our interview notes, we recognized that it wasn't only that those leaders were working in a collaborative way, they set the tone of collaboration that reflected the entire operation and that even stretched out to the community. And so what we recognized, and as we were studying this, is that there was something very unusual about this leadership behavior. And one of our colleagues, Eric McNulty, who is fascinated with birds and bees and their behaviors, as we're studying this, walked into my office and he said, swarm intelligence. And I said, swarm intelligence, what's that? And he said, well, it's the way bees are able to cooperate, the way they communicate with one another. They're structures of behavior that allows them to figure out large, complex problems by working together. And the more we studied swarm intelligence, the more we recognized that those same qualities and traits existed among the leaders of the Boston Marathon bombings response. So as we studied them, we discovered the 5 principles of swarm leadership, and I want to share with you them with you today. The first was there was unity of mission, and all of the people that we interviewed, the first thing they said to us about their thinking and their behaviors during the Boston Marathon bombings response was it was all about saving lives. For example, there were 2 bombs that went off very close to the finish line. And because there had been work done to train people to the possibility of secondary devices, everybody was thinking, there have been 2 bombs. There were 4 planes on 9/11, 4 bombs in Madrid during 7/7. There were 4 bombs in London, and everybody was thinking there could be 2 more bombs. And yet they ran out in the street to do the evacuation of people who were injured. They completed that evacuation in just 22 minutes. And what they told us is, we thought there could be more bombs. However, save lives, they ran into that situation. They very, very scoop and run. They moved people out off the street. They moved them into triage in a very, very efficient way. So everybody was thinking save lives, unity of mission throughout the week. Even the purpose of the FBI, when we interviewed Rick DeLoria of the FBI, he said, we were thinking we've got to move quick. We want to catch these guys before they commit another violent act. And they did, in fact, have more bombs and more munitions for more attacks. So unity of mission, save lives. The second principle that came out as we were interviewing these leaders was generosity of spirit and action. Right after the bombs took place, after the bombings took place, there was another explosion at the JFK Library, and the head of the Secret Service called up the head of the Boston Police Department and said, how can we help? And he said, look, we don't have enough people to send down to the Kennedy Library. Just you guys take that. And what we learned in all of these interviews is that everybody was out there to help one another. One of the fascinating things is on the last day of that week, the younger of the 2 brothers, Tsarnaev brothers, escaped and was hiding someplace in Watertown, Massachusetts. So the whole city was closed down, Watertown was closed down, and there were hundreds of people in full tactical gear moving house to house, searches in houses, trying to find that young man. And at the, as we were interviewing one of the people, chief of the Boston Police, at the end of the interview, so what was your biggest regret of the response? He said, we were in the command center. We had all the food, water, and bathroom facilities we needed. But after the end of that day, I realized we sent hundreds and hundreds of people out there. in full tactical gear, and we just were so consumed with what we were doing that we forgot food, water, or bathroom facilities for all those people. He says, I just feel terribly guilty about that. Well, we were intrigued, so we investigated. Turned out that when these individuals, when these people who were part of the search walked into someone's house to do a search, people said, hey guys, you need our bathroom? Can we make you some sandwiches? Here, take some bottles of water. They had all of the food, water, and bathroom facilities they needed, not because anyone asked the people in the community to do that. Once this swarm leadership takes effect, people were just there, just willing and eager to help out without even being asked to do so. The third principle was everybody that we interviewed told us about how everybody stayed in their lanes, did their job, and helped others succeed in their lanes. So there was enormous cooperation among all of the different agencies. Don't forget, there was a federal response, it's a state response, it was a local response in Boston, and there were a lot of businesses that were involved. So everybody did their job, stayed in their lane, helped others succeed in theirs. The other interesting thing is no ego, no blame. You know, nobody was going around saying, oh, we're the ones who figured this out. We're the ones responsible for everything that went well. And then nobody was going around pointing fingers. That was that, emotional intelligence that I talked about, the person of the meta leader, extraordinary behavior and camaraderie among these leaders. And with that, a foundation of trusting relationships. These people really trusted one another. They had confidence in one another. They were really working together, open lines of communication. So we discovered these as the 5 principles of swarm leadership. And after we developed this, we went back to these leaders. In fact, one of the people I called was Rick Deloria, who's pictured here, the SAC of the FBI. And I said, Rick, this is what we came up with. And he very carefully listened. And when I was done, he said, Lenny, that describes exactly what we were doing, though I had no idea at the time that that's what we were doing. And so we've been since studying this phenomenon of swarm leadership. And yes, we discovered swarm leadership in the midst of a crisis, the Boston Marathon bombings. What I encourage you to be thinking about is how can these principles of swarm leadership be brought to bear in the crisis that we're facing right now? And if you want to think about where swarm leadership might exist, think back on offices where people were really, really working together in a really tight fashion. And they had these qualities, or where, for perhaps a faith-based organization, where people are really out there for one another, really looking after one another. And there is this quality of swarm that exists among people. And even as we've been studying the COVID-19 response, among the leaders we've studied was the phenomenon of the governors. Remember the governors, end of March, early April, there was a real shortage of ventilators. And there was a lot of connection and a lot of collaboration and cooperation among the governors, sharing supplies of ventilators, moving resources around, developing collaboration on plans for reopening. And so they're different, not perfect, and we don't look for perfection, but we see it on a continuum. On one hand, there can be these elements of swarm. On the other hand, there could be elements of suspicion. And you as a meta leader can have an impact on whether the operation is more akin to swarm, very, very productive. That's the scenario in which the kind of partnerships that we're talking about at this conference can thrive and can be so supportive to all who are involved in the crisis response, versus on the far end, suspicion, where it's not unity of mission, it's everybody out after one another. It's not generosity of spirit, everybody's claiming for themselves. It's not staying in their lanes, it's me taking your authority, your resources. It's all ego, all blame, and people don't trust one another. That's the opposite of swarm. And so what I'm suggesting to you today in building and thinking about these partnerships is how can you bring the quality of swarm into your work? I mentioned very early on the hurricanes Harvey and Irma and Jose back in 2017, and we were with the Red Cross. Brad Kaiserman, who is the Vice President of Disaster Services for the Red Cross, allowed me to embed with him. We were also down in Houston, and he had everyone in the headquarters learn these principles of swarm leadership, so it became the way that they were thinking and working together. And it could infuse the way the leadership that they brought to the operation. So you can incorporate this thinking, you can incorporate these practices of meta leadership, of swarm leadership into your work. If you're interested in learning more about meta leadership, a few ways to do that. One is through the Harvard National Preparedness Leadership. So if you look online at npli.sph, schoolpublichealth.harvard.edu, we're offering seminars on meta leadership that goes deep into each of these tools of meta leadership. We also talk about the traps of leadership, what can be distractions and get you offline. So there are a lot of videos that go into much greater depth than what we've had today at the NPLI website. So feel free to use the NPLI as a resource for you in your leadership. And if you also want to go deeper, there's a book that we came out with about a year ago titled YOURE, Crisis, Change, and How to Lead When It Matters Most. And this chronicles these 15 plus years of study of leaders in times of crisis, in times of everyday, with tools, with stories, and ways that you can make this part of your practice as a meta leader. So Sarah has been sending me questions. Sarah, do you have any questions, or does anyone want to send a question to Sarah about anything that we covered today? Sarah?
Yes, thank you. So we don't have any in the queue right now. So please, if you have a question, please submit it either through the Hub platform or through YouTube, wherever you might be viewing the session. But I was, as you were going through the presentation and showing the, worst case scenario, best case scenario, a lot of your typical natural disasters typically affect a very centralized, area in that state, or maybe neighboring states will work together to recover. But since this pandemic is affecting the entire country, entire world, I feel like some states are on the path of the best case scenario and some states are on the path of the worst case scenario. So how can leaders across the country really try to work together to help, unify the path?
So that's a great question. And, one of the interesting phenomena of the way our country is structured is that we're different jurisdictions. And there are the rights and the responsibilities of the federal government, the rights and responsibilities of state government, and then, of course, city and municipal. And what we're finding is that different jurisdictions are approaching COVID-19 in very, very different ways, different policies and different practices. One of the things that we think is really important is many times people say, well, we couldn't see this coming. COVID-19, it was so shocking. We've never seen anything like this. Actually, that's not true. Here in the United States, I was at the CDC in Atlanta meeting with their crisis leadership at their Emergency Operations Center, January 29th. There were 5 cases in the United States. I happened to be there the moment that a plane with American citizens were being repatriated from China. And that was the first plane that was coming in to do the repatriation. And that was really the moment when we went from containment, just 5 cases, to having to begin the process of mitigation. We could foretell what was going to be happening in this country by just looking what was going on in China. Yes, it was hard to imagine in late January that we would have a situation where our whole country was sheltering in place, like what we were seeing in Wuhan, China, where people were at home, just going out for basic needs. Businesses were closed. Hard to foretell in January. However, for those people who understood the nature of this crisis, they could see that what was going on in Wuhan, what was going on in other cities in China, was soon going to be happening here in the United States. Similarly, it's possible to look at the differences between states and simply say, well, what's going on right now in Florida, Texas, Arizona? What are they doing? What policies and practices do they have? And we can see that every day, the numbers of cases keep going up. So the decisions made by those leaders is really shaping that curve and this arc. And the arc is getting much, much higher. And that's going to make reopening, that's going to make the whole process of bringing that curve down even more difficult. So what we're seeing today is Governor Newsom out in California. He's taking action really to take California back to businesses are closed, restaurants, bars are closed, there are restrictions on schools, there are other restrictions that are putting in place, really having to go back to the restrictions that had been in place before. So some states were very, very controlled and disciplined in how they handled the first arc, what they did with that second arc of time, and they're looking toward a best case scenario. Other states are looking at that worst case scenario. And if you want to know what it's going to take to reshape the arc of time in your state, just look at all of these experiments that we have and what it takes to reduce the number of cases, to responsibly reopen businesses, building the partnerships that we're talking about at this conference in order to leverage capacity and restore societies back to as normal as they can be prior to the emergence of a vaccine. So there's a lot to learn by looking at others, replicating what's working in other states and in other countries, and avoiding what we see is only contributing to the increase. Once that arc of time gets much higher, the complications only are greater. It's more people who are out of work, more disruption to our economy, and certainly very, very difficult when we're talking about interstate commerce. For example, the travel industry, people moving from one place to another place that's a hotspot to a place such as Massachusetts where our cases are very low. We're concerned here of travelers coming into Cape Cod and the Berkshires and raising the number of cases that we have. So that's the situation from state to state. And again, a really interesting lesson in these arcs of time. And for you, look at what you can do in your own organization or your agency that will affect the arc that you're experiencing. What are the parameters? What are the variables that you can affect? And then be very clear the relationship between the actions that you're taking and how it will affect the arc of time for your organization or for your jurisdiction. Sarah?
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Have we gotten any other questions so far?
We have not.
So I'll ask myself one last question, and hopefully it'll be helpful to you. People are intrigued with how swarm leadership works. First off, it's a little bit hard to make that leap, understanding the intelligence of birds and bees, fish, swarm, and then how that pertains to us. And so if you're intrigued with the idea, look at your extended family. If there are elements of that swarm that exist in your extended family, what encourages those sensations of swarm and the impacts of swarm, and what detracts from it? You know, sometimes if one person gets up and is very, very ego-driven or starts blaming other people, that can reduce the phenomenon of swarm. And look back at different places that you've worked. What had more of the swarm qualities? What had less of the swarm qualities? And with that, ask yourself questions. To what extent would the qualities of swarm leadership build the partnerships that are critical for us to respond effectively to this significant crisis of COVID-19? Because remember, it's not only a public health crisis, it's also an economic crisis, it's a social crisis. And what we are doing now, what we're doing today, will foretell what it looks like in the upcoming arcs. So once we have the vaccine, how will we rebuild society? How will we rebuild our economy? Institutions such as schools, institutions, municipal services, businesses, how will we rebuild them? And the beginning of that rebuilding comes in how we're responding to the crisis right now. Hopefully, you as a meta leader will be able to look back and you'll be proud of what you've done through these months and through these days. That pride will help you as you're in that process of recovery. And simply, if your organization, the people that you're leading, can look back one day with pride on what was done today, it likewise will help in the recovery through those future arcs that we're going to have to go through as organizations, as agencies, as states, and as a country, as we one day rebuild from the difficult period of COVID-19. With that, Sarah, I think we're at our conclusion. Thank you to all of you for your leadership. Please don't hesitate to use the NPLI website as a resource for you in developing your own leadership capabilities. Thank you for everything that you're doing, and stay healthy.